Marlon Brando changed American movies forever with his amazing, powerful acting. He created characters we'll never forget in movies like A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and The Godfather. The way he acted was so different and real that it forced Hollywood to completely change how actors performed. He became the first real rebel movie star. Everyone agrees he changed acting forever, but there's another side to Marlon Brando's story, a more personal one. This side challenges what we thought we knew about this famous movie star and the time period when he lived. Throughout his whole life, Brando kept his feelings about his own sexuality complicated and mysterious. Sometimes he'd say surprising things about it, but he'd never give straight answers. This was during a time when being honest about these things could completely destroy even the most famous person's career. Marlon didn't believe in putting sexuality into boxes, said a former assistant who worked closely with the actor during the 1970s. He once told me, "Desire doesn't understand gender, it just understands attraction." This wasn't him trying to make some big political point, it was simply how he actually experienced his life. In the many years since Brando died in 2004, the careful walls between his public life and private life have slowly come down. Now we can see a fuller picture of who he really was. Through stories from people who knew him personally, books written about him after his death, and occasional confirmations of relationships that people had whispered about for years, we've started to understand the full complexity of Brando's love life. This included important connections with men, along with his more well-known relationships with women. What most people don't understand about Brando is that his sexuality was just as rebellious and rule-breaking as his acting, explained celebrity biographer Thomas Henderson. At a time when admitting you were attracted to the same sex meant your career would be destroyed, Brando refused to follow those rules. Even if he had to hide much of his truth using vague language and keeping his personal behavior private. Today, we're going to explore 4 important relationships that show this hidden part of Brando's life. These connections range from confirmed love affairs to deeply close emotional bonds that don't fit into simple categories. These relationships span many decades of the actor's life. They reveal not just his private attractions, but a revolutionary way of thinking about human connection that was just as ahead of its time as Brando's ground-breaking approach to acting. Marlon Brando's relationships with men reveal more than just extra chapters in his romantic story. They give us crucial insight into the extraordinary complexity of a man who refused to follow conventional rules in every part of his life. During a time when being gay was still considered a mental illness and could instantly destroy even the most successful Hollywood career, Brando's willingness to pursue real connections, no matter if they were with men or women, represented a form of personal rebellion. This was just as important as his professional innovations in acting. These relationships weren't just small side stories in Brando's life. They were fundamental parts of a life lived according to his own rules instead of society's expectations. From intense emotional bonds that went far beyond normal friendship, to confirmed physical affairs that challenged the era's strict sexual categories, Brando's connections with men show us more than just his personal preferences. They show his lifelong rejection of artificial limits on human experience. By exploring these relationships with the care and detail they deserve, we gain a more complete understanding of an icon whose private complexity matched his public genius. No, I just thought I'd try that for a while. You know, after 20 years, give yourself a break. Of all the revelations about Marlon Brando's private life that have come out since his death, maybe none surprised the public more than the confirmation of his brief but passionate affair with comedian Richard Pryor in the 1970s. This unexpected connection between two of entertainment's biggest rule breakers stayed hidden for decades, but it was finally confirmed in 2018, not by rumors or guesses, but by someone who knew Pryor very personally. Yes, the comedian. This simple confirmation came from an unexpected source, Jennifer Lee Pryor, Richard Pryor's widow. When people asked her about claims of the affair, she responded with straightforward acknowledgement instead of denial or dodging the question. Her matter-of-fact confirmation turned what might have been dismissed as celebrity gossip into established fact. It forced people to reconsider what they thought they knew about both men's public images and private realities. The revelation started with music producer Quincy Jones. He mentioned the affair almost casually during a wide-ranging interview in 2018 with Vulture magazine. When asked about Brando's sexuality, Jones stated very bluntly that Brando would fuck anything. He'd fuck a mailbox. James Baldwin, Richard Pryor, Marvin Gaye. While some of these claims were disputed by estates or couldn't be verified, the mention of Pryor received unexpected confirmation. This was confirmed by Pryor's own widow, Jennifer Lee Pryor, in 2018, noted entertainment journalist Rebecca Santos. Instead of dismissing Jones's comments, as many people expected, she validated them through a statement to TMZ and posts on social media. She stated not only that the affair had happened, but that Pryor had been open about his sexuality with people close to him. Jennifer Lee's confirmation included important background information that helped explain the relationship within the cultural landscape of 1970s Los Angeles. Rather than treating the affair as scandalous or shameful, she presented it as part of the free-spirited exploration that characterized both men's approach to life during that time period. She said Pryor was openly bisexual in the 70s and that he and Brando had a brief but wild sexual relationship. Santos continued, "This wasn't just confirmation of a single hookup, but acknowledgement of an ongoing connection between two men who, despite their public heterosexual relationships, privately acknowledged broader sexual interests." Jennifer Lee put the affair in context of the cultural moment of 1970s Hollywood. She noted, drugs were still good and sex was free. It was the 70s. This explanation helps us understand how two major celebrities could engage in what would have been considered career-ending behavior just 10 years earlier. The period after Stonewall, but before AIDS, created a brief window of time when sexual exploration flourished in certain circles. This was particularly true among artists and entertainers who already lived somewhat outside conventional social boundaries. What makes this relationship particularly important in understanding both men is how it goes against simplistic stories about their public personas, while reinforcing what we know about their rebellious approaches to social norms. Both Brando and Pryor built careers challenging conventional expectations. Brando did this through his revolutionary approach to acting and his constant refusal to conform. Pryor did it through comedy that confronted America's racial hypocrisy with unprecedented honesty. Most fans still don't believe it, but insiders swear it happened, and noted Santos. This skepticism reveals more about the public's rigid understanding of sexuality than it does about the relationship itself. People had placed both men in heterosexual boxes based on their public relationships with women. This made it difficult for people to accept evidence that contradicted these simplistic categories. For people familiar with both men's private histories, however, the confirmation merely validated what many had long suspected. Both Brando and Pryor approached sexuality with the same boundary-breaking attitude they brought to their respective arts. Pryor's autobiography and personal writings revealed a man who rejected limiting labels. Meanwhile, Brando had made numerous statements throughout his career, suggesting a fluid approach to sexual attraction. The timing of their connection happened during particularly transformative periods in both men's lives. Brando was transitioning from the career comeback of The Godfather and Last Tango in Paris toward the more eccentric later phase of his career. Pryor was evolving from a relatively mainstream comedian into the revolutionary voice he would become with albums like That Nigger's Crazy and Bicentennial Nigger. Drugs were still good and sex was free. It was the 70s. This simple statement captures the cultural context that made their affair possible, a moment when traditional boundaries were being questioned across American society. This was especially true within the artistic communities of Los Angeles and New York. For men like Brando and Pryor, who had always pushed against society's constraints, this era offered unprecedented freedom. They could pursue authentic desires without the rigid categorization that previous decades had demanded. The Brando-Pryor affair, brief as it apparently was, represents more than just an unexpected celebrity connection. It shows how two cultural icons navigated the complex terrain of sexuality and identity during a transitional moment in American history. They chose authentic personal expression over the safety of conformity, just as they had done throughout their revolutionary careers. People say racing is dangerous, but I'll take my chances on the track. Strongly rumored, never confirmed. Few Hollywood relationships have generated more persistent speculation than the alleged connection between Marlon Brando and James Dean in the early 1950s. Though it was never confirmed by Brando himself, and it's impossible to verify after Dean's untimely death in 1955, this rumored relationship has maintained a lasting place in Hollywood lore. It persists not because of concrete evidence, but because of the compelling psychological dynamic it suggests between two of cinema's most influential rebels. Their lives overlapped in the early 50s, noted film historian Margaret Collins. This was a pivotal moment in American cinema, with Brando already established as the industry's most exciting new talent following A Streetcar Named Desire, while Dean was still struggling for his breakthrough role, which would come with East of Eden in 1955. The timing created a significant power imbalance. Brando at age 30 was already a transformative figure in American acting, while Dean at 24 was still seeking the recognition his talent deserved. This professional gap reportedly formed the foundation of a complex personal dynamic that multiple biographers have characterized as both mentorship and manipulation. Several biographers suggest Brando dominated Dean emotionally and possibly sexually as part of a twisted mentor relationship. Collins continued, according to these accounts, what started as professional admiration on Dean's part evolved into something more personal and intense. Brando allegedly recognized Dean's attraction to him and exploited it. Central to most accounts of their relationship is Dean's well-documented fascination with Brando. Friends and colleagues from this period consistently describe Dean's almost obsessive study of Brando's acting technique, personal style, and public persona. This influence was so pronounced that early in Dean's career, critics frequently dismissed him as merely a Brando imitator rather than an original talent. Dean was said to be obsessed with Brando, and Brando allegedly toyed with him, observed Collins. Multiple sources from this period describe Dean constantly talking about Brando, studying his performances with unusual intensity, and even adopting aspects of his speech patterns and mannerisms. What remains disputed is whether Brando reciprocated this interest in any genuine way, or merely used it to exercise power over a young actor who idolized him. Among the most frequently cited sources about the relationship is Brando's longtime friend Carlo Fiore, who lived with Brando during this period. He later wrote about witnessing interactions between the two actors. While never explicitly confirming a sexual relationship, Fiore described scenarios that suggested unusual intimacy and emotional intensity, particularly on Dean's part. He used Dean like a mirror to reflect his own chaos. This observation, attributed to someone who knew both men, captures the psychological dynamic most biographers have emphasized. Whatever physical relationship may have existed, the emotional connection was characterized by narcissism on Brando's part and desperate need for approval on Dean's part. The lack of definitive evidence hasn't prevented virtually every biographer of either man from addressing the rumored relationship. The persistence of these accounts across decades of scholarship suggests something more substantial than mere gossip, even if concrete proof remains hard to find. No proof, but every Hollywood biographer includes this rumor because it never died, noted Collins. When a rumor persists this long and appears in so many credible accounts, historians must consider why. Sometimes the absence of smoking gun evidence doesn't negate a pattern of consistent testimonies from people who observed the relationship firsthand. Dean's early death forever prevented his perspective from being recorded, while Brando maintained his characteristic vagueness about intimate matters throughout his life. When asked about Dean in interviews, Brando typically acknowledged his talent while distancing himself from any significant personal connection. He often suggested that he barely knew the younger actor, despite considerable evidence to the contrary. What gives this rumored relationship particular significance, beyond celebrity gossip, is how it illuminates the complex power dynamics of 1950s Hollywood. This is especially true for actors navigating same-sex attraction in an era when exposure meant career death. If accounts of their relationship contain truth, it reveals not just private behavior, but the psychological burden of maintaining public images fundamentally at odds with private desires. He used Dean like a mirror to reflect his own chaos. This observation captures the essence of what most accounts suggest about their dynamic. Whatever physical dimension may have existed, the psychological component involved Brando recognizing aspects of his own rebellious nature in Dean. He alternately encouraged and rejected this reflection based on his own emotional needs, rather than any genuine concern for Dean's well-being. This pattern, if accurate, would be consistent with what we know about Brando's complicated approach to intimacy throughout his life. An ability to form intense connections that nonetheless remained fundamentally self-focused. Others served primarily as mirrors for his own emotional experience rather than true partners in mutual vulnerability. There's no need to fear. Underdog is here. Perhaps no relationship in Marlon Brando's life defies simple categorization more thoroughly than his lifelong connection with actor Wally Cox. Beginning in childhood and continuing until Cox's death in 1973, this bond went beyond conventional definitions of friendship. It created an intimacy so profound that it raises questions about the arbitrary boundaries we draw between different types of human connection. Brando called Cox his soulmate and kept his ashes in his bedroom, noted biographer Thomas Henderson. This wasn't just sentiment. Brando literally maintained a daily physical connection with Cox long after his death. He kept his cremated remains on his bedside table for decades and reportedly talked to them regularly. When Brando himself died in 2004, one of his final wishes was that their ashes be mixed together and scattered in Death Valley, a request that created legal complications but speaks to the extraordinary importance of this relationship. The origins of their connection reach back to their childhood in Libertyville, Illinois, where they met as schoolboys. Brando was the physically imposing, emotionally volatile son of alcoholic parents. Cox was the slight, intellectually sharp child who would later become known for playing meek, nervous characters on television. This unlikely friendship would endure for more than 5 decades, surviving Brando's meteoric rise to fame, multiple marriages, and the geographic separations created by their respective careers. What distinguished this relationship from ordinary friendship was the emotional intensity Brando attached to it, an attachment he occasionally acknowledged in surprisingly candid terms for a man who typically maintained careful ambiguity about his intimate life. He once said, "If Wally had been a woman, I would have married him." Henderson continued. This statement, made after Cox's death, reveals how Brando himself struggled with society's language limitations in describing their connection. The frameworks available in mid-20th century America, just friends or lovers, failed to capture the complex reality of their bond. According to people who knew both men, their relationship contained elements of intellectual stimulation, emotional support, and physical affection that went beyond conventional male friendship of their era. But it didn't necessarily conform to sexual partnership as commonly understood. While they were reportedly not sexual in the traditional sense, the intimacy level was so intense, many believe it crossed into romantic and possibly physical territory. Observed Henderson. People who knew them described them finishing each other's sentences, maintaining hours-long phone conversations, and displaying physical affection that exceeded typical male friendship of their generation. When Cox died suddenly of a heart attack in 1973, Brando was devastated in a way usually associated with the loss of a spouse rather than a friend. The contrast between Cox's public persona and Brando's adds another layer of complexity to their relationship. While Brando projected raw sexuality and rebellious intensity, Cox cultivated a career playing mild-mannered, often effeminate characters. He was most famous for the 1950s-60s television series Mr. Peepers. This apparent opposition may have created a complementary dynamic that allowed each man to access aspects of himself not easily expressed through his public identity. They were inseparable, and whatever it was, it went deeper than friendship, noted someone who knew both men. There was a completeness they seemed to find in each other's company that neither found elsewhere, despite Brando's numerous romantic relationships and marriages. With Cox, Brando displayed a vulnerability and ease rarely seen in his other interactions. What makes this relationship particularly significant in understanding Brando is how it challenges the rigid categories often imposed on human connection, especially for men of their generation. Their bond suggests the possibility of intimate attachment that doesn't fit neatly into available terminology, but nonetheless represents one of life's most meaningful connections. Brando's possession of Cox's ashes, which he allegedly obtained against the wishes of Cox's widow, represents perhaps the most concrete evidence of the relationship's extraordinary importance in his life. According to multiple sources, Brando kept the ashes in his bedroom for the remaining 3 decades of his life, sometimes speaking to them as if Cox could hear him. They were inseparable, and whatever it was, it went deeper than friendship. This observation captures the essential quality of their connection, one that went beyond conventional categories while remaining, in Brando's own estimation, one of the most important relationships of his life. Whether defined as elevated friendship, non-sexual romantic attachment, or something for which we lack adequate terminology, the Brando-Cox relationship reveals the potential depth of same-sex bonding that exists beyond our limited cultural frameworks. While most aspects of Marlon Brando's complex personal life have gradually emerged in the decades since his death, one relationship remains shrouded in deliberate mystery. It's a connection that people closest to the actor describe as perhaps the most emotionally significant of his adult life. References to this relationship appear only in coded journal entries and occasional private conversations, creating a shadowy but compelling outline of the man who reportedly affected Brando more deeply than his numerous public relationships. Brando referenced this man only in coded journal entries, according to his assistant, explained celebrity biographer Thomas Henderson. Unlike his relationships with women, which he discussed relatively openly despite his general privacy, this connection remained almost completely hidden from public view. Yet people who knew him well understood its profound significance in his emotional life. According to sources familiar with Brando's private writings, the relationship involved an unnamed European actor whom Brando met while filming abroad in the late 1950s. Unlike most of Brando's romantic entanglements, which typically featured him as the pursued rather than the pursuer, this connection reportedly reversed the dynamic that Brando had grown accustomed to in his relationships. Described as tender, cruel, unforgettable, noted Henderson, quoting phrases attributed to Brando's private writings. These descriptors suggest an emotional complexity that went beyond physical attraction, a connection that engaged Brando intellectually and emotionally in ways that most of his relationships did not. What made this relationship particularly significant in Brando's life, according to people familiar with his private history, was the unusual power dynamic it created. Throughout his adult life, Brando's extraordinary fame and sexual magnetism typically placed him in the dominant position in his relationships. Others pursued his attention and affection rather than the reverse. Said to be the only person Brando ever chased, observed Henderson. This inversion of his usual romantic pattern apparently created an unprecedented vulnerability for Brando and emotional exposure he rarely experienced in other relationships. In those relationships, his status as the desired party provided a certain protection against rejection. The relationship reportedly ended when the European actor became involved with a woman, creating a rejection that affected Brando far more deeply than people familiar with his typically detached approach to romance would have expected. According to people close to him during this period, the experience created an emotional wound that never fully healed, influencing his approach to intimacy for decades afterward. Rumor says the man left Brando for a woman, devastating him. Henderson continued. This abandonment reportedly triggered profound feelings of inadequacy and rejection that contradicted Brando's public image as the ultimate object of desire. The inability to sustain this particular relationship, despite his extraordinary attractiveness and fame, created a narcissistic injury that reverberated throughout his subsequent life. The timing of this relationship coincides with a noticeable shift in Brando's public behavior and professional choices. He went from the focused intensity of his early career to the increasingly erratic and self-destructive patterns that characterized his later work. While multiple factors contributed to this transition, people familiar with his private history suggest that the emotional aftermath of this particular relationship played a significant role. Brando was never the same after that. His rage got louder, his heart got quieter, observed a longtime associate. Something fundamental changed in how he approached both his work and his personal relationships, a withdrawal into emotional self-protection that showed up as increasing eccentricity, unpredictability, and detachment from the creative passion that had defined his early career. The deliberate obscurity surrounding this relationship, with the man's identity never revealed even in Brando's private papers, speaks to its continued emotional significance throughout the actor's life. Unlike many of his affairs, which he discussed with relative openness among friends or even occasionally in interviews, this connection remained carefully guarded. It was a private wound too tender to expose to public scrutiny. Brando was never the same after that. His rage got louder, his heart got quieter. This observation captures the essential impact of the relationship, not just a romantic disappointment, but a transformative emotional experience that altered Brando's fundamental approach to vulnerability and connection. The man who had revolutionized acting through emotional authenticity reportedly retreated from his own emotional truth after this rejection. He created the increasingly eccentric and deliberately provocative public persona that characterized his later decades. What makes this hidden relationship particularly significant in understanding Brando is how it goes against the common perception of him as emotionally detached or incapable of genuine vulnerability. Despite his reputation for treating relationships casually, this experience suggests a capacity for profound emotional investment that he deliberately concealed beneath layers of provocative behavior and studied indifference. He was protecting himself from further rejection by preemptively rejecting authentic connection. Marlon Brando's relationships with men revealed dimensions of his character that add to rather than contradict what we know about this complex cultural icon. Throughout his life, Brando maintained a fundamental consistency, rejecting artificial boundaries, challenging conventional expectations, and insisting on authentic experience regardless of social taboos or industry pressures. The same revolutionary spirit that transformed American acting through raw emotional truth guided his approach to human connection. It created a personal life as boundary, breaking as his professional innovations. What emerges from examining these relationships is not a hidden identity, but a more complete picture of a man who refused simplistic categorization in all aspects of his existence. Brando didn't merely accept occasional same-sex attractions as exceptions to an otherwise conventional sexuality. He rejected the entire framework that separated human connections into rigid categories. He pursued relationships based on personal resonance rather than societal approval. This approach placed Brando decades ahead of contemporary understanding of sexual fluidity and relationship diversity. Long before modern discussions of the spectrum of human sexuality, Brando lived according to his own internal compass. He formed connections that ranged from passionate physical affairs to emotional bonds that went beyond conventional definitions of friendship or romance. His famous statement that homosexuality is so much in fashion it no longer makes news wasn't mere provocation. It was a reflection of his genuine perspective on the arbitrary nature of sexual categories. Perhaps most significantly, these relationships show why Brando remains such a compelling and mysterious figure long after his death. The same authenticity that made his performances revolutionary informed his personal life, creating a rare congruence between artistic expression and lived experience. While many actors maintained rigid separation between their public personas and private realities, Brando pursued truth in both realms. He accepted the professional risks and personal complexities that such authenticity entailed. As we continue to reassess cultural icons through contemporary understanding, Brando's approach to sexuality and relationships appears increasingly prescient rather than scandalous. It's less a hidden secret than an aspect of his character that society lacked an adequate framework to fully recognize during his lifetime. The man who changed how actors approached emotional truth on screen lived that same truth off-screen. He created a legacy of authentic self-expression that goes beyond simplistic labels and continues to challenge our understanding of human connection in all its complex, boundary-defying forms.